Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. Today, I am joined by Jacqueline Bush. Jacqueline is a therapist specializing in attachment repair and grief. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Hi, thank you.
It's the first time that we've actually met before, but I've, come to your work through Claire Bidwell-Smith, who you work closely with. And I know that you've been doing grief groups and having a special focus on anger, which we'll get to later in the course. But I just thought, first of all, would you like to introduce yourself to the people that are listening and watching, and how you personally came to work in the grief space?
Yeah, sure. I'll just start by saying, for those of you who are listening, I'm imagining you're listening because you've experienced loss. And I just say, I'm so sorry. And, it sucks. And I wish none of us had to deal with it. It's so painful. And, it's not for the faint of heart. And also grief is such a natural part of life. It happens around any kind of trauma, because trauma is defined as the events that turn the world on our head as we know it into something different. And the reaction to that is oftentimes trying to fit it into the old world. And we can't quite compute it in that way. And that's what causes that trauma piece. And when that happens, if we don't move through the process of grieving, whatever it is, or whether if it's abuse or loss of a dream, divorce, breakup, or death, allowing ourselves to move through the process of grief can be incredibly transformative if we let it. And that's the gift of dealing with what nobody wants to deal with. And so a little bit about my background is I have a fair amount of trauma in my own background, and that's great in the sense of it's really, I believe it's my life purpose to help others, heal and also allow the experience of transformation, as I like to say, because if we don't have that, then you kind of get stuck in an arrested state of development, and stuff will bleed out the back end, and relationships and work and all kinds of mental health diagnoses, depression and anxiety, and we don't want that, right? So the best we can do is allow for a softer experience. And I came to becoming a therapist a little bit later in life. I had another career prior, and as I mentioned, I was on my own healing journey, and I felt like this was truly something meant for me. I loved being with people in such an authentic way where there's no mask and there's no small talk, and we can just be honest, be present, and help someone kind of move through their experience. And after I finished my master's program, and I was looking for therapists to work with, because as you start working, contrary to what people think, you don't just graduate with a master's degree and go straight into work for yourself. You get supervised just like a medical doctor would, which is wonderful and provides a lot of tethering around and extra training. So you do that for a few years. And as I was looking for a supervisor, I've always been more on looking for the cutting edge. Like, how can I really help people be efficient, and seeing both the problems with the mental health industry of what's inefficient and ineffective and what works. And I really wanted to be with someone who I felt I was really hungry, and wanted to be with someone who inspired me and I felt was doing something different and really offering something unique to the field. And that was Claire. Her work is very profound in the field, and she was doing stuff that nobody else had been doing prior. And so I was lucky enough for her to take me on as a supervisee, if you will, and kind of learned through her around the grief work. And with that, that's where I became very clear how it's absolutely integral that we grieve whatever we're going through. Like I said, broken dreams, breakups, not just death, that this was just a crucial part of the experience. And a lot of us had been lacking that. And with that, well, like I said, will on the back end provide imbalance, right? And the more I started to learn, the other piece of that is around attachment work, which many of us now, the very popular book nowadays is the book Attached, and it's trending. It's been around for quite some time, since actually the theory has been around since the 70s, but different things strike at different points of time. And the attachment system is located, it's a physical system. We'll call it the emotional threat response system, if you will. It's located right next to the physical threat response system within the limbic system of the brain, right? So it's a physical system within the brain that basically gets developed through, we know, the intergenerational piece, which oftentimes, as we've found out in 2013, Emory did a study where they trained rats to fear the scent of cherries. And when those rats bred offspring, the offspring were immediately scared of the scent of cherries. And the reason I bring that up is because oftentimes we go, oh, why do I have this mental health diagnosis? Or why am I suffering in this way? And we're now starting to understand how much of the back piece of generations upon generations, that whole nature versus nurture, how much of that plays into what we have currently in our bodies, right? So there's that piece, along with how our parents respond to us as babies, both in emotional distress as well as joy. And there's a few different styles of that. And basically, the goal would be, we want to get to a more secure place. I truly believe that if we live in that place of security, which I really call inner trust as well as that external trust. We know how to trust ourselves, our boundaries, our feelings, trusting whether we're in joy or distress, and knowing how to support ourselves, as well as trusting the experience of living, right? And if we have that, what that offers is a much softer experience around the world and in the world. And through grief work, what's interesting is they find that people who have that more secure, inner trusting state will actually have a softer experience around loss. And if you fall into one of the other categories, which is the more insecure types, and we'll just call that, it's kind of like an umbrella of fear, and it kind of manifests in different ways. And if you lie under that, you may have more problems in relationships, a difficult time feeling safe in the world, heavy fears of abandonment, which can come out as high anxiety, feelings of not being good enough, right? So I believe these go hand in hand with grief, because it's all part of the experience of understanding what we didn't get and how to support ourselves in that. And part of that will be grieving what we didn't get, not to blame, because everyone's doing the best they can. And our parents get their attachment system based on what their parents gave them, right? The cycle repeats unless we change that. And so going back to that grief piece and loss, understanding how to help somebody have a gentler experience, or where they can use, the little cracks, right? Which that insecure attachment or that fear can be the crack that actually gives us the peace in order to understand that there's something inside us that needs attention right now. And how can we lean in and support that, be present with it, and allow it to transform us? And I know I've said transformation many times, and that's because I truly believe if we keep in the kind of repetitive tape of why me, which is a really important part of starting to process an experience that's very painful. At some point, we'll say death in general can often be very unjust, or there's so many experiences in the world that are unjust. And what I've found is that if we start looking at it as, how can this transform me? It really allows us to step to the left of the whole story of, I've just got to slap a Band-Aid on this and get through it. And I've got to power on, because that's still kind of setting yourself up for this is right and this is wrong. And therefore we stay stuck in the experience, and we never really allow ourselves to kind of be in that world in the new way. And why would we want that? Again, because it'll just allow us a less painful experience along the way. And scientifically, we know there's more of what we don't know than what we do know. So why can that not be true?
Amazing. That was so much great information there, Jacqueline. And it's super interesting actually to hear about the attached concepts. Funnily enough, I bought that book only like a week ago and started reading it myself. So it is interesting how our attachment style will impact how we grieve, and how anxious we are. And I think like what you're saying about staying in this place of curiosity around our grief, like how is it transforming us, as you said. can help us, can help us in the grieving process, as opposed to like, why me? Which is also, like, as you say, really an important place to be as well. I think sometimes we can think, oh, I want to have all the lessons and all the growth, but we also need to stay in this is not fair, that I'm in the victim. And I think there's a lot of validity in that, and being in that place as well.
There's such a fine line between I'm going to allow this to transform me, right? Which can be that toxic positivity or toxic spirituality that we talk about nowadays, right? It's not that, it's that, just, being in the zone of being supportive of all of those feelings while having the curiosity at the same time to continue the exploration, as well as supporting our experience, will give us the transformation. We can't just jump through the other side. And oftentimes we hear that. And because we're inherently built for pleasure, yes, I want to go, where's the transformation? Where's the thing? Let me get out of this. And no, Def, I'm very clear on that. No, we're not doing that. Not helpful. It again will bleed out the back end, and the point is to move through this with more support, not a tricky way out of not supporting our more painful emotions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And talking about those painful emotions, it's so interesting. Like you say, we're hardwired for feeling pleasure. And I think so often when we feel anything that's not making us happy, we want to run from it, or we think it's bad, as you mentioned, the right and the wrong. And I guess I was super interested to really talk to you about anger, because I know that these are the groups that you're specifically working on at the moment. And anger can be a difficult thing for some people to even acknowledge or want to deal with, and they don't know how to deal with it. And so I wondered if you could maybe, talk about anger and what you think is a healthy way to move that energy.
Absolutely. One of the reasons I chose to run the group is because my automatic reaction is oftentimes anger. So I really relate with all you angry bunnies out there. That's also my immediate response. And it's mainly about things that are unjust, right? Whether it's towards me or towards the world, it's coming from an honest place, a good place. My supervisor, Claire, doesn't quite have the same response. I was like, I got this. I think, I have a lot of experience around this. And also not just the empathy, but again, understanding that anger is not bad. It's perfectly natural. And oftentimes there's gender expectations around should women feel angry or not, or men kind of have gotten, historically, things are shifting a little bit nowadays, but at the back end of not allowed to feel any emotion, but anger is one that they can jump into. And that usually happens because we're oftentimes not allowed to have our full experience of emotions. So then the anger comes out because something else is suppressed in some way. So that is a part of it, as well as, looking at our family histories, what our caretakers' experiences were around anger. Did you grow up with angry parents, or was that how they responded to their own injustices, or was that their way to draw boundaries with other people, right? So all of these things are going to play into whether it's anger or something else, what emotions we lead with, right? And anger is particularly scary, right? Because it feels very uncontrollable when it can flip the switch to the rage, right? And then I don't know what to do with all this stuff. And it can be very polarizing for other people. Other people, oftentimes people don't, can be afraid of anger. So if you're having anger, it can be very isolating because it's hard to get that support from others, right? Or we accidentally, unintentionally push them away because of our state. It can be hard to allow in the support and care. And again, I just qualify with this. It doesn't mean the anger is unjust. I'm just talking about all the different ways that we respond to it, that people respond to it. And one of the things I've noticed, and this is something that I touch upon in my group around anger, is that even when we feel so justified in our anger because of all these pieces I mentioned, there's oftentimes also a piece of it And it can be so small. I always use the analogy of the princess and the pea story. If there's a pea-sized amount, even if you put 100 mattresses on, you will still feel it. And that pea-sized amount, whether it's large or small, is the resistance to the anger of part of me that also says, I shouldn't be feeling this way. And the reason that is so important is because, we go through and, perhaps if you're experiencing the loss of a loved one that happened in a very unjustified way, perhaps there was a lot of stuff murder, for example, or inefficiency in the medical system, right? There's so many ways that we can experience stuff that's greatly unjust, right? And even when we have that, it's not saying, it's saying, yes, I'm angry at it. I notice that there's oftentimes still a little piece that says, I shouldn't be, that piece that goes, oh no, I should feel this way about it. It can be so slight. And so learning to support just by doing inner validation, which if you would like, I would give a quick example.
Yeah.
That's okay. So if I, Jacqueline, feel very upset about the loss of my grandmother. And so I would repeat back, yes, I hear that there is something inside me that is really upset right now. And then I'm just going to get curious and explore and see, is there any part of me that says, I don't want to feel this? And as I say that right now, I can see there is also a part of me that says, and I don't want to feel this because I don't want to feel the pain. So I'm going to turn around and validate that. Yes, I also understand that while I am angry about the loss of my grandmother, there's also a part of me that doesn't want to feel this. So it sounds so simple, but I swear I do this time and time again. And I learned this from a program called Somatic attachment therapy. And I'm a huge advocate of it, and it really changed my perspective as a therapist. By doing this, what we do is learn to support ourselves, right, in that distress, as well, all of the feelings around the distress. And what that does is start to create that secure experience where we can feel held in all of our feelings, right? The part of me that says, I don't want to do this right now. And the part that says, I feel this, and continuing to be curious of what else comes up as I just tell myself, I hear you. Maybe I feel sensation in my stomach. Maybe a memory comes up. Maybe more emotions come up, just continuing to explore. And so going back to that anger piece, anger can be transformational because it provides to us a window that something is going on. Something within us needs our attention. And if we just get curious and explore, we don't immediately jump to, how can this transform me? No, we allow ourselves to be supported by the experience. And through that, the kind of blossoming of the flower starts to unfold or bloom. And then the transformation piece comes. Perhaps it's, I need to advocate for certain injustices in the world, or like myself, my past, or even Claire too, right? Claire experienced loss at a young age. She has books out there on how she's lost both of her parents and her experience, and she's made her life's work. The source of her deep pain has become her life's work. I'm not saying that everyone has to do that, but I'm saying that allowing our experiences to integrate and understanding how they can transform us can be greatly healing for ourselves as well as others. That anger piece might also say, there's somewhere I need to draw boundaries. Something in my life is not working. What can I do to shift that? Getting to a place where you want to have the relationship with your anger as well as all of your emotions, like a loved one. How can I, treat you well? How can I have compassion for you? And what are you trying to tell me right now, right? Because our anger is giving us messages about what's going on inside of us. And beneath anger, oftentimes there's usually fear or sadness or both. Anxiety also can fuel a lot of anger. So sometimes when we pull off the anger lid, it's like, oh, I'm feeling so much anxiety. Yes, because anger can be fueled by that anxiety. And the good news is then the deeper we get into the roots, we can fix it, right? You slap a Band-Aid on a gaping wound that needs stitches at some point, it could get infected and you might have to get your leg cut off, right? I know that's an extreme example, but it's the same principle. If we're not fixing the root of the problem, you won't actually get well, right? And so we never want to slap a Band-Aid on the anger. We want to become curious about it and build a relationship with it and explore it. And what I find with groups, which is truly healing, is you meet others who can support you and say, oh yes, I identify, I feel the same way. And some of my family members or friends might think I'm crazy or tell me this, well-intended, terrible advice around getting over it or whatever it is, these mixed messages. Grief has not been really supported by our society, right? It's maybe starting to shift a little. So there's a lot of awful things that people unintentionally say that can create more anger, right? And so being in a group where you're experiencing support around others who've been through the same experience can be greatly healing. We're interdependent humans and we're meant to lean on each other and lift each other up and support it and care for one another.
Yeah, completely. And while you were talking then, I loved what you shared about, underneath grief essentially is fear and sadness. And I think that's a very helpful thing for people to remember, particularly if they're experiencing other family members who are acting out in anger. Maybe that's not your kind of reaction, but other people in your family are being you're finding them not compassionate, you're finding them not understanding because they're in this anger. And ultimately, underneath that, just to remember that they're feeling the sadness and the fear and the worry, and that's what they're kind of masking it with. And I was thinking, why do you feel that people sometimes prefer to go to anger than drop down into the feeling of fear or sadness?
Well, the brain actually, when we experience anger, the brain actually releases endorphins into our body. So on some level, it's like, people who cut, the same thing happens. You release endorphins release in your body, which provides, that's why it provides the reward system to keep coming back for more, right? So anger along the same lines releases endorphins. So there's this feel good way. It can provide a sense of power and control. That's where I said fueled by anxiety, right? Because, when we're anxious, we have great fear about unpredictability, right? That's where anxiety is coming from. And for the record, none of us can get away with feeling no anxiety. If you don't think you have anxiety, you are in denial, because if we weren't anxious, we wouldn't want to survive. We wouldn't want to feed ourselves. We wouldn't want to do things in the world, right? It's just levels of this stuff, right? So again, it's never to get rid of anger, get rid of sadness. It's just levels of this. So coming from that feel good place where it's physically doing something from our bodies, as well as offering some kind of sense of control in some capacity. It should be this way. In some way it says, right, like this is the narrative that should be true. And there's something that can feel inherently good about that, as well as I mentioned before, that kind of childhood conditioning of what messages you got around how to handle stuff that feels of a boundary violation in some capacity, right? There's all these different factors that are going to play into why I might come to the table with more aggression or anger than you, Tara. Your response might be like, I don't, maybe you shut down, right? Which is another way, like the nervous system, right? Fight, flight, freeze, or now they're talking about fawn, which is the people pleasing, the blending of the two states. When I'm dysregulated, I go into fight. When you're dysregulated, you might go into freeze. Neither is bad or good, but understanding that even if we're in a very angry state, a heightened angry state, that our nervous systems are actually dysregulated. That is going back to the emotional threat response system I mentioned, the attachment part. It says there's somewhere inside of us that feels threat around our survival. There's something inside of us that says this, and so now I'm going to try to make it safe in some capacity. And anger is a great way to feel that power, right? Which, evolutionarily speaking, if you're in the jungle, that anger might give you a burst of energy where actually perhaps it requires you to do something where then you survive, right? So again, it's using these things as our power source of, it's not pushing it away, but understanding, if that's my first response, how can I dig in and explore this so that we're able to use that piece when the time is right, when we need to, as well as okay, soften in when the experience can be deeper and in a new way, so that we're able to, because if we're in the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, we actually aren't open to new ideas, right? So we've got to re-regulate our systems so that we can be open to new possibilities, which, why would you want to do that? You can't actually heal if you're not open to new possibilities, right? One of the key signs, Bessel van der Kolk and Gabor Mate, who are two kind of, front runners around the healing of trauma. Both of them talk about how imagination, possibility, creativity are huge. Playfulness are signs that we're in more balance with ourselves, and show us that we've healed, for lack of a better term. I like to call it balance, because healing is like as if we're broken, and it's just, who knows? This experience of life is so confusing. And like I said, there's more of what we don't know. So we don't know. I just want to know that when I feel more connected to my honest emotional state, I feel better, right? And I notice that it's a different experience in the world. So just kind of breaking it down there can help us, again, kind of get beneath it. You're not going to be able to do that in the moment, probably, when you're feeling anger, right? Because your nervous system's dysregulated. If your sister grew up with more punishment, perhaps she received more punishment from her parents than you did, she might have an angry response where your response goes into the freeze response. There's all these factors, as well as men versus women, like I said, as well as intergenerational pieces. There's many, right? So we can talk about the things we do know and hold possibility for all the things that we don't know that also can play into the experience.
Right. And I was just going back to when you earlier, because you're sort of talking about like how we can manage the anger, and you can go into a group, or you mentioned the somatic process. Do you use a movement as well in your work?
So I do a lot of my main practice is remote right now. So it's more of allowing that person to experience it. But sometimes I'll have people get up in our session if they need to, or tap on themselves, touch them if they're feeling disconnected from their bodies, for example. Somatic is integrating the body within the work, and I truly believe the body keeps the score, right? So sometimes we can go, the mental health will give you just so much up here, not understanding that it's all connected, right? We now know we have, the gut brain and how the vagus nerve, right? This is the largest nerve running in our body that connects the brain to the gut, right? There's nothing is separate. Somatic work can be as simple as doing that exercise I showed you of exploring what I feel inside, not just inside my body, but if a memory or emotion comes up, all of that is part of somatic, because we're allowing ourselves to be connected to our feelings in real time, within the moment. I strongly believe in the power of movement to heal, especially around the regulation of the nervous system. So sometimes if I notice, especially around people who run anxious, they tend to be people pleasers. And so with people pleasing, we can, if we're somebody who leads with that, we can kind of railroad over our own boundaries, because deep inside there's a part that says, in order to feel safe, I need to feel the connection with you. And if I draw a boundary, I won't feel safe, right? So I talk about how if there's something inside them that feels resistant, feels the anger, or feels like maybe you're just looking at the clock, wanting the session to end, right? That's that pea-sized amount of resistance that's there. Or if you find yourself lost in thought, that dissociation, it shows me that you're dysregulated. So I talk about that with people at the beginning and help them understand why it's so important, because there's a certain amount that you can feel quite a lot through Zoom. And sometimes, especially as you get to know people, certain things might not register right away, right? So even having them have that experience of, oh, this is how I respond, starts to connect, right, with the somatic piece, that body awareness of, oh, I'm checking out right now, or, oh, I'm resistant. Okay, so what do we need to do right now to re-regulate the nervous system within the session so that we can proceed forward at a pace that's not going to overwhelm you, right? And so again, that somatic piece is really important, because when we're in overwhelm, we're just going to shut down. And we never want to give, and this has happened. I've had this experience in therapy years ago. I now understand my my therapist didn't mean to. The information was different at the time, but pushed me past my limits. And when that happens, you can re-traumatize a client, right? So we never want to do that. We always want to make sure that we're not stretching the client too much. Otherwise, they'll experience the snapback on the other end, right? And so with the nervous system regulation, movement can be huge. And it's not just movement, it can be temperature change, right? That's a somatic experience. Breath work can be a somatic experience. Walking, I think it links, I heard this, don't quote me on this, but that it links like the limbic system with the neocortex. I know it fires the left-right actions of our brain. Dance is huge around healing as well, singing, chanting. And with dance, it's in a non-pattern ways, right? We want to be free. So maybe even the lights off with in a room with no mirrors, maybe no one's around, and maybe even to songs that you're not so familiar with, so that you can have more abstract expression of your body. And so I'm a big believer in incorporating that in our daily life, right? To keep that system regulated. And I just want to preface, certain people might not feel safe in their bodies based on experiences that happened in the past or historical pieces, right? There's all these components that can play into, I don't feel safe in my body, which again is why we always want to move into the work in a way that is with intention and pulling out it. I always like to say, like, dip in, dip out, so that we can create the experience of safety within, especially if you haven't had one before. Right. So even with that, there's a slowness around it and a gentleness to understanding, how can I connect to my body? It might even be taking a sip of water. That is somatic work, experiencing how it feels to have the water go down my throat. Is the water cold or hot? This is a somatic experience.
So interesting, Jacqueline. I love everything that you're sharing. And I also try and highlight to people about just moving, like not grief, just we can't figure it all out just from our heads, even though we'd like to think we could think our way out of it, but it just,
it wouldn't be nice.
My final question is, what would your interpretation of conscious grief be?
Yes. Recently Claire and I ran a group called Conscious Grieving, and I sat with this concept a lot. And what it is the experience of kind of the awareness of the experience as we're in it. And why is that so important? It shifts the whole experience, right? So what I mean by that is, I often ask people, what do you do for self-care? Which, for the record, self-care is not the icing on the cake. It is the preventative medicine, right? If you're already like, oh my gosh, my self-care is, I haven't been doing any, you're probably in damage control, right? So we want to look at how can we integrate these things on a daily basis. If I start understanding that a way to soothe my nervous system is taking baths or going on walks, and I wanted to say this earlier, I'll oftentimes, because I practice this work, I'm such a believer in it. It shifted so much for me after over a decade in therapy, understanding this stuff. It pushed me into secure attachment. I realized that had never really happened before. So now my experiences just in general, pain or joy, are different experiences. So I just wanted to put this out there. Like talking on a walk, just kind of blurting out my feelings as I'm walking can be a really helpful way to get that consciousness around what am I actually experiencing. But noting that if I am dancing, walking, journaling, creating, right, doing art projects, whatever it is, understanding that that's a way to soothe my nervous system, it actually changes the experience about what it is, right? It brings us more soothing, right? So that conscious grieving part is when I understand that I'm having the awareness of how deep my experience is in a way, it kind of helps us move through it quicker, right? Because we're more present. That's the consciousness piece, right? It offers us more presence, as well as I suspect more self-compassion, which is also a key component to healing, which, as a recovering angry person, took me years to understand. I couldn't figure out how to have that self-compassion piece. It came through the consciousness of being able to support my emotions, the consciousness of, oh, I'm feeling angry and a part of me doesn't want to, right? Like that's a consciousness around the experience of anger, right? So it brings us into a deeper sense of presence. And yes, will move us through it faster, but we can't say, I'm going to do this to move through it faster. It, again, doesn't quite work like that, unfortunately. I really wish it did too. Still waiting for the magic bullet myself.
Thank you so much for that, Jacqueline. And before we finish, is there anything else that you would like to share with the listeners before we end?
Yes, I would. I just want to share with all of you people out there dealing with loss, be open to all kinds of experiences and stuff that maybe you would have been closed to before. And I say that around offerings, around stuff around the immaterial world, like be open to just exploring, and figuring out what works for you. Allow your world to be changed, right? We don't know what's possible. And our brains can say, oh, I know exactly what's possible because this is what was handed to me. But again, going back to that, whatever you believe in around the material world, the immaterial world, things we cannot see, just knowing that there's always more of what we don't know than what we do know. So keeping an open mind and allowing yourself to explore, no matter how insane it seems, I'm a full proponent of, and I support you in that.
Oh, wonderful. That's great advice for everybody. And it's just been amazing listening to you. You have got so much wisdom and knowledge to share. So thank you for everything. And thank you, everybody who's been listening, and sending you lots of love. Bye.
Bye-bye.